This is the third of 6 planned events for our series on the 60s at 50. And tonight I'm just going to be introducing relatively briefly the folks who are going to be on stage and who are going to carry the conversation for our first hour and 15 or hour and 20 minutes. And then, as has been our custom throughout the other events, we'll turn things over to the audience to see if there are questions. I should say a quick word too about, again, we're halfway into the series now, a third of 6 speakers. The next speaker is coming in what will be our spring semester at the end of January 31st. That's Charles Kessler, who is a professor of politics at Claremont McKenna College, and he's also the editor of the Claremont Review of Books. So we hope that maybe we'll see some of your faces for that event as well. If you want to find some more information about any of the speakers who are to come, or indeed any of the speakers who've already been here, you can look for our webpage, which you can find by plugging into your browser Bucknell and 60s. It should be one of the first couple of hits that come up on your browser. We also, tomorrow night at the Campus Theater, have the third film in our installment of films on the 1960s. Which is going to screen at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. This is the film We Were Soldiers, which is an adaptation of an account of an important battle in the Vietnam War between American troops and North Vietnamese regular soldiers. There are a whole bunch of films on the Vietnam War, which those of you who are film aficionados will already know. This is one of the few that in my view at least, really tries to account honestly and fully for the military effort on both sides of that campaign. And I think it just gives a pretty brilliant depiction of some of the stuff that was going on, some of the stuff that was facing people in this war. So I certainly would encourage you, if you have some time tomorrow night and you haven't seen that film, to think about stopping by the Campus Theater and to join us for that screening. Tonight, our guest is Dr. Mark Moyar, who is the author of a number of books on the war in Vietnam. Maybe the most noteworthy of these books is a volume that dates back from 2006, 2007, published by Cambridge University Press, a book titled Triumph Forsaken, in which Dr. Moyar argues that a fair amount of what we might believe we know about the war in Vietnam from the mainstream narrative is in fact mistaken, or is at least misleading, that it doesn't give us a full account of what was actually going on in the battlefield, and what were the consequences of some of the things that were happening in the political sphere and in the mass media sphere here in the United States on the war effort. So Dr. Moyar has, I think, the kind of pedigree that you would expect would have rewarded him with a position in an academic department in history, but for all sorts of reasons having to do with the way in which the politics of history departments and universities break down today, he wound up finding himself in another career trajectory, but has nonetheless continued to produce academic work of the highest rank and historical work of the highest rank on this and a number of other topics. Just wrote a book, in fact, last year on the Obama administration's efforts with respect to American military efforts around the globe that makes some pretty trenchant criticisms of what we've been up to there. So Dr. Moyar is our guest, and the bulk of our time tonight will be dedicated to giving him space to talk about his research on the war. The two hosts who are going to be asking questions of Dr. Moyar are on my far left over here is my Bucknell colleague, Bill Groover, who has a joint appointment in international relations and finance, and also has military experience from the Vietnam era, and so there's a personal element of his own trajectory that's involved in the topic tonight. And then over here on my right is Ian Ferguson, who is a retired colonel in the Marines, and a Bucknell graduate, 1985, did you say? So also has some history with our institution and some real personal connection to the particular piece of the 1960s that we're going to be talking about tonight. So again, the plan is to fire some questions at Dr. Moyar and to let him take those on for a little while, and then we'll turn things over, and we hope we'll have some good participation from you folks in the audience as well. Thanks very much again for attending, and we hope you'll enjoy tonight's conversation. Bill.
Thank you. Mark, my first question, in 1954, President Eisenhower gave a speech on the political situation in Indochina in which he introduced the dominant metaphor used by succeeding U.S. administrations to justify American political involvement in Vietnam. And I will quote the president, "You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one? Is a certainty that it will go over very quickly." The domino theory has been the target of much criticism in the years since the Vietnam War ended. What are your thoughts on the domino theory, and was it a valid strategic rationale for American involvement in Vietnam?
Thanks for that question. And first I want to thank Bucknell for inviting me here too, and thanks to Tristan, Alf, the rest of your group for hosting this, which is it's a wonderful venue we have here too. And thanks to all of you for coming amid all your other commitments. So that question you asked is you're really at the heart of the debate over the Vietnam War. So when I first got into this, the domino theory was often, especially in academic circles, kind of assumed to be, you just kind of assumed that it was inherently false. And there was a famous book by Frederick Logevall, who's now a professor at Harvard, saying that he just took it as axiomatic, as he put it, that the reasons we went to war in Vietnam were mistaken. So I'll run you just quickly through the key parts of this debate. So when you hear about the domino theory being maligned, typically the argument, the foremost argument is that 1975 you have the end of the war, Saigon falls, and you only have a few dominoes falling like Laos and Cambodia, and where over 1 million people were killed, but in the grand scheme of things you could say, well, most of the other dominoes in the region, Thailand, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Philippines, they don't go communist, and so turns out domino theory was wrong. So I have a couple problems with that. The first is that 1965 is a very different time than 1975, and I'll get into that in a minute. Another part of this narrative that is worth addressing is the origins, the historical origins of the conflict. So those who would say that this was a fruitless war typically point to Ho Chi Minh's alleged independence from the Chinese. So central to the domino theory was this idea that China and North Vietnam were conspiring to spread communism across Asia. And so the argument goes that Ho Chi Minh was in fact the Tito of Asia. He was a nationalist, he wasn't really much of a communist, and he didn't like the Chinese. And in addition to that, the Chinese and North Vietnamese have long hated each other. So I spent a lot of time going back, looking through the details on that. So for one thing, the idea that China and Vietnam were historical enemies is not quite true. So there was a lot of enmity until about 1,000 years ago. In the last 1,000 years, they'd only fought 3 times. So 3 wars in 1,000 years, not the kind of enmity we would tend to think of. And in fact, Vietnam was a vassal of China for much of that period. Then the idea that Ho Chi Minh was this independent nationalist also is not really substantiated at all. There's a single quote that no one really knows where it came from, where he makes a derogatory remark about the Chinese, but he's actually referring to the nationalist Chinese, who are, in his view, the bad Chinese compared to the Chinese communists. On the other hand, we have a great deal of evidence that Ho Chi Minh was, in fact, really a die-hard communist, and he believed firmly in the theory put forth by Lenin that communism should be international and we should not put nationalism in front of communism. And so the idea for him that he would turn against his Chinese allies is just unthinkable. We also know there's been a couple good biographies within the last 20 years of Ho Chi Minh. We now know he spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union, a lot of time in China, served in the Chinese army. So that whole part of the narrative, I think, crumbles away. Now, specifically 1965, why that's so important. So U.S. makes the decision to go into combat full scale in 65 because the Vietnamese government is near its deathbed at that point. And so Lyndon Johnson's looking at the situation. He actually, I think, has a pretty good understanding, better than he's given credit for. I fault him on other things. But he looks at the region. China It looks very aggressive, pushing its view of the world. North Vietnam is clearly with it. And the most interesting thing I found looking at this period is what was going on in these other countries. So what were the Taiwanese thinking? What were the Japanese thinking? The Malaysians, the Thais. And if you go look at them, they all believed in the domino theory at this time because they saw, for one thing, they saw this, it was in fact a Chinese-Vietnamese combined effort. They also were all convinced that if the United States were to leave Vietnam, this would send the clear signal that the United States had abandoned this part of the world. And we had previously made a commitment in Laos to try to do this. It didn't work out. The other really big part of this is what actually happens in Indonesia, because if you look back through the record, you'll find Indonesia was the key domino in our mind, more important than Vietnam. 100 million people, world's largest Muslim country, great natural resources, has tried critical sea routes, and turns out Indonesia in mid-65 is veering towards communism. Its leader, Sukarno, is basically espousing support for the Chinese, and the Indonesian military comes to us on the eve of this decision and says, what happens in Vietnam is going to determine the fate of all of Southeast Asia. And after Johnson goes in to make this commitment, there is a military coup and counter coup that ends up overthrowing the Sukarno regime and putting Indonesia in our camp. And that is, I think, probably the most direct evidence we have of how important this was. The last thing I would mention on this is that, nobody disputes that Asia in general was worth fighting for. No one says that Japan or Indonesia or Taiwan was unimportant. And I think if you look historically in the broader spectrum, I think there's a very good book recently called The 100-Year Marathon talking about China in 1949 after the Civil War had set out a goal of dominating Asia by 2049. And if you look at what's going on today in China, China is very much pursuing that policy, and we, I think correctly, have said that our biggest national security threat now is Chinese expansionism. And so had we given up Indonesia, Japan, Taiwan, et cetera, we would be, I think, in a much weaker position, because right now, if you look at our assets in the region, U.S. is certainly not going to contain China alone. And so we have countries that, in my view, I think make a very good case that those countries are not pro-Chinese at this point because we bought them that time between 1965 and 75.
So before I ask my first question, I'd like to thank you personally as someone, and maybe there are others in the audience. I think by the hair colors out there might be a few others in my category, whose life was profoundly influenced by the Vietnamese War. I'd like to thank you for sharing your wisdom with us tonight. And I'd also like to thank the audience. I see many students in the audience in the last week of classes with a lot of other competing demands on your time, for devoting the attention to hear such a distinguished guest as Dr. Moyar tonight. So my question is one of more contemporary observations on the war. Mm-hmm. General H.R. McMaster, who, as you know, was President Trump's second, I think, national security advisor, he wrote in a book recently called Dereliction of Duty, and in it he said that the war in Vietnam was not lost in the field, nor was it lost on the front pages of the New York Times or on the college campuses. It was lost in Washington, D.C. Even before Americans assumed sole responsibility for the fighting in 1965, and before they realized the country was at war. Indeed, even before the first American troops were deployed. What has your research revealed on these points? Furthermore, you argue in your book, Triumph Forsaken, that the role of journalists in spreading their version of the war in Vietnam was material. What was the role then? What is the role today for media in setting the stage for political discourse on topics like Vietnam?
Yeah, excellent question. So let me start with 1963. I think the single biggest, most important, and most damaging event for the United States was the coup of November 1963 that overthrew President Ngo Dinh. And so spent a lot of time looking into this. And again, in the case of some other things, if you dig deeper, you find a lot of information that I think sheds new light on this subject. So Diem, just a little bit of background. When countries divide in 1954, the Ho Chi Minh gets control of North Vietnam and President Diem gets control of South Vietnam. And a lot of people think he is doomed from the start because he didn't have this massive military apparatus that Ho Chi Minh had. But he's able to fend off some opponents early on. The communists kind of sit back and think they're going to watch it explode, but he actually consolidates power. In the 50s, South Vietnam is actually seen as a model of U.S. ally in the region. Now, in 1960, the communists decide that they are going to stir up trouble. They kind of political machinations aren't working, and they're going to do an armed insurgency. In the first couple years, don't go very well for the Diem government. They're not well prepared to deal with this, but 1962, Diem really turns things around. The war is actually going pretty well, and that whole part of it has gotten, I think, pushed aside because certain people had interest to hide it, but the book goes into great detail, including looking at what the communists were saying. So 1963, things continue to go well. All of a sudden, you have this group of Buddhist activists who start accusing the government of religious persecution, which you could probably say there's religious discrimination at the time, although people have pointed out there was also discrimination against Catholics in the United States at this time. So I don't think it was egregious. And the government initially does a pretty good job tamping it down. But then this group of agitators goes to some American journalists, foremost among them David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan, and convinces them that they are legitimate and they have these terrible grievances. And we later know that, later found out that some of these Buddhists were in fact inspired by communists. One of their key interlocutors with the American press, we know Pham Xuan An came out and said he was a communist. And so they manufactured this crisis. And there's a huge debate within the U.S. government over what to do about this. There are some who think we should support a coup against South Vietnamese government, and most notable among that is Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge. There's others who are strongly opposed, and President Kennedy is kind of waffling in the middle. In the end, Lodge starts pushing this coup through despite orders from Washington to hold back, and in my view, this wouldn't have happened except that the reason Lodge was out there was Kennedy had sent him there to undermine him with the idea that the 64 election, Lodge might be a candidate. And so now with Lodge out there, Lodge was a Republican, yes. So now that Lodge is there, he can't pull him out. And so the coup goes forward, and Kennedy is extremely upset. We now know he goes into depression because he didn't think the coup would lead to the death of President Diem. And it's clear from all the evidence that the war goes into a tailspin. There's these massive purges. Communists make this very clear from their accounts, and this leads them to push for decisive victory. The next big thing that happens is the Tonkin Gulf incident of August 64, where there's an attack. We think there's two attacks. The administration thinks there's two attacks, probably only one, but there's an attack on an American ship, and President Johnson thinks what he's going to do. Some of his advisors tell him to follow Thomas Schelling's economic theory, and which is game theory and abstract reasoning, and they do a single bomb strike against the North Vietnamese, thinking that, in the academic speak, this is going to send a message to the enemy and they will desist. Now, we know clearly from the North Vietnamese side, they actually interpret it as the opposite, that this was a sign of weakness, because if you could really hurt them, why wouldn't you do it? So this, plus the coup, plus Lyndon Johnson saying, we're not going to send American boys to Asia, convinces the North Vietnamese that they can invade and get away with it. So the end of 64, as soon as Johnson's reelected, they send a full division into the South for the first time. And then there's also an opportunity the U.S. has, early 65, to increase the bombing, and that CIA Director McCone is pushing for this. Johnson decides not to. Another missed opportunity. And then one other missed opportunity that I talk about too is that there was interest in cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. All the supplies for the North Vietnamese were coming in, most of them through Laos. Johnson chose not to do that. He underestimated its value. So in my view, there were a great deal of missed strategic opportunities in that early period. There's some in the later period as well, I would say.
And the role of the media then as opposed to now?
Yeah, so the media is interesting because in this early period up to this coup, they are actually in favor of the war. So Halberstam and Sheehan are pushing for this coup because they think it'll make the war effort more successful. They are sort of Cold War liberals who believe in this cause. And it's only later, after the war goes south, that they actually turn against it. And so they have this behind-the-scenes influence that I think we didn't understand as much. The media is much more famous for how it treated the Tet Offensive. And in the Tet Offensive 68, since we're at the 50th anniversary, President Johnson, I think he was demoralized by the media coverage, which showed this as a major defeat for South Vietnamese when in fact it was a victory. The media by then was very partisan, but actually the biggest consequence of that was that President Johnson dropped out of the presidential race and they ended up with Nixon. So I think that media in that case is not as problematic. I mean, having spent a fair amount of time with our media more recently covering wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think they've become more responsible than in the latter parts of Vietnam. I would say Johnson, to some extent, invited this on himself because he was not forthcoming. He misled the American people on a number of occasions, especially Tonkin Gulf, and so that contributed to some of the media cynicism.
Thank you.
Dr. Moyar, my next question is on our Vietnam veterans, like Bill, a submariner, and I know we probably have some veterans here, so thank you for your service. In a lot of the popular culture and media, there's been stereotypes. One stereotype seems to be that you have these veterans that went over, or they weren't veterans at the time, but they went over and they served in Vietnam, and then they came back, had some sort of revelation, and then they're hardcore anti-war activists, and they protest the war. And then another stereotype would be that they suffered from PTSD and that they have major psychological problems, and that is all due to their service in Vietnam. So I'd like to know, because you've probably obviously interviewed a lot of veterans in your research, what are your thoughts on the profile of the Vietnam veteran, and what effect might the draft have had on the makeup of the force that served over there? And after you're done with that, I have a follow-up.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think there's been great misinformation about Vietnam veterans. In my first book, I worked on Vietnam on the Phoenix program. I got into this because there were a lot of sort of lurid accusations about people being killed in their sleep, or mass atrocities committed by the Phoenix program. So I've met a guy named B.G. Burkett, who later wrote a book called Stolen Valor, which is really the best single source on this. But with his help, we figured out that all of the people making these stories were actually either never in Vietnam or they were in a support unit and didn't do any of the things they said. And that was really quite eye-opening. Now, Burkett in his book has, I think, over 300 cases of these phony veterans, but a lot of that has steered some of the discussion. I think there's been people who I think want to portray veterans in a negative light because perhaps they chose not to go, and one rationale for supporting that decision is, well, look at all the terrible things that happened to our veterans. If you look statistically, Vietnam veterans actually fare pretty well compared to their peers in terms of employment, because that's another stereotype. They all came home and were homeless. They are much more positive about the war than is generally believed. If you look at, there was a very informative survey in 1980 that over 90% of veterans were glad to have served in Vietnam. And the PTSD, I think, one of the arguments that was made early on was that PTSD was this new phenomenon that was peculiar to Vietnam. And I think pretty much everyone now accepts that that's not true, and that now there is something that is PTSD. The definition of that has also been problematic. But if you look back in any other war, you see people with the same symptoms. It's a function of our biology reacts in certain ways to certain types of stress, and so there has certainly some people did come back with PTSD, but there's also, and Burkett also covered this in great detail. I think there was active efforts by the Veterans Administration to kind of encourage people. Plus, there was a lot of financial incentives for people to report PTSD who didn't really have it. I spent one of the virtues of the internet is you get to meet a lot of people you probably would not have met before. So I get to meet a lot of veterans that way, and I'd say most of them are very positive. Even some who, I think you could say had PTSD to some extent, have generally positive about their service. So I think that is crucial as we think about the legacy. And you mentioned the draft as well. I mean, there were not as many draftees as we are often led to believe, especially in the early years. Certainly there were some, and it does put the military in a different light from what we have today. But there were a lot of well-educated people. That's another thing that Burkett really found out, is that it wasn't all just the poorest elements of society going to Vietnam. There were a lot of middle-class and upper-middle-class Americans who did serve in Vietnam.
Yeah, and for all you veterans out there, I remember when I first went in the Marine Corps, I found that a lot of your senior staff NCOs and officers were obviously Vietnam veterans, and they were tremendously well-adjusted. But they like to work hard, play hard. That was what I remember. So, like you, Professor Gruber. I want to stay with the draft for a minute. We talked about, you mentioned the draft Vietnam. What do you think about, there's a lot of contemporary arguments now about national service. You'll see it come up in the press, and then there'll be a little bit of debate about it. In light of your research on Vietnam, what do you think about the possibilities or what national service might be today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I tend to think it would be valuable to have every American, at least every American male, go through military service. Spent some time in Europe. Europe now you can do a civilian equivalent, which I think that has some merit. Although I do think there's a difference between domestic and overseas service, because I tend to be of the view that our government's most important function is protecting the country, and so I view that as in a different category. But there may be, I think, value in other types of service as well. But I think we as a people inherently have a capacity to take things for granted, and I think, and it's not just this generation. I mean, you heard the same arguments in past generations, but I think that service can be useful in terms of helping people understand and value their country, and it's also a way of, I think, strengthening bonds among Americans, because I think over decades and probably some of this started in Vietnam, we, to some extent, have lost a sense of a common Americanness or American culture, and so the military in the past has been a way to bring people together from all parts of the country, different races and religions, around common themes, and so I think it would be valuable in that way.
Thank you.
So I think I can probably speak with some confidence that each of us in the room has at least seen a part of, or perhaps all, or certainly heard of Ken Burns' documentary on the Vietnam War. A mentor of Ian's from the Naval War College, Professor Mac Owens, and himself, a Vietnam veteran, Marine, he has written about the Burns series. And in that review, he said, the point is not that the Vietnam revisionist argument, perhaps speaking of present company, is unassailable. It is rather that a major public television documentary series that never even acknowledges the existence of more than one interpretation of the war is either lazy or dishonest, doing a disservice to the program's subject and its viewers, as well as to the troops who fought in that conflict. What's your view of the Burns series? How well does it capture the reality of the war? and of the contestation of the meaning of the war? And what important thing, if anything, does it miss or misrepresent?
Yeah, so I am also a huge critic of the Burns series. I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, another City Journal that has a bunch of things that you can find. And we also, when I was at a think tank, hosted an event on this. We invited Burns and his co-producer, Lynn Novick, to come. They had previously talked to us about wanting to have dialogue and discourse, but they ended up not coming, although one of their advisors took part. But I agree with Mac Owens. There was a lot of intellectual dishonesty in this. It was portrayed as being sort of objective and neutral. If you look at who their advisory panel were, it was clearly very skewed against the war. Now, for those who, especially people who are too young to have remembered the war or know much about it, Burns is, I think, fairly skillful in giving you an air of impartiality. And there are bits and pieces that I think are more balanced than some of the previous productions, like the 1983 PBS show. But for those who are familiar with the points, there's an overwhelming bias in it, and most of it is more errors of omission than errors of commission. One of the biggest problems with the Burns series is who they chose to interview. So they have a fairly small number of veterans who they repeatedly bring on. And he doesn't tell you this, but I looked into a lot of these characters. A lot of them were part of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And if you look, Vietnam Veterans Against the War never had more than 1% of the total veteran population. So we're talking about a very small group of people. And a lot of these veterans talk about how terrible things were, how disillusioned they became, and that's fine, that's a valid viewpoint, but they actually come across as the majority opinion. You have very few veterans who actually take a more positive view of how things went. And this also, having the internet now, it's just enormous amount of traffic on the internet from veterans when this came out about how it did not adequately represent what they saw in Vietnam. They also selectively pick evidence. So one of the things I did is look in the battles they chose to cover in different years. And most of the battles in Vietnam where the Americans fought were overwhelming American victories. There were a smaller number where, usually because something unexpected happened or a mistake was made, that the Americans took significant casualties. And this was mainly because superior American firepower usually won the day. But Burns very much focused on that small number that didn't go as well and gave you this false impression that Americans were constantly failing and making mistakes, and really kind of cast the American military in a negative light. And that's something else that attracted a lot of the criticism from veterans. He is slightly more nuanced about the communists, but doesn't really go into much detail about the human consequences of the war. By best estimates, 65,000 people were killed in 1975, shortly after the war. He doesn't go and look at the re-education camps where hundreds of thousands of people were died of starvation, or the boat people that fled. So to gloss over that and something that's seen as supposed to be this authentic, comprehensive history, I think did a great disservice to veterans. And so again, I think it's too bad, because a lot of people, that may be all they have seen of Vietnam, especially younger folks. And I would encourage anyone from younger generation who's seen that to do some looking on the internet about what people have said about it, because again, I think it was incredibly dishonest.
Another one. Mark, it's been argued by Douglas Pike, among others, that the bombing campaigns against North Vietnam were effective. The 65 campaign, according to one writer, produced enormous dismay and apprehension. And your book talks about that too when reviewing the transcripts from the North Vietnamese. Mm-hmm. Pike believed that the kind of campaign we launched in '72 in the Christmas bombing, had it been undertaken in February 1965, the Vietnam War as we know it might have been over in a matter of months or even weeks. And also that our own Congress bears some responsibility late in the war when we kind of took away the purse strings to fund the effort, and the regime actually carried on for a long time before the North actually finished the deal. So with bombing or the Ho Chi Minh Trail or us funding the war, can you give maybe a counterfactual of how things might have gone differently?
Yeah, so in the bombing, I think clearly the North Vietnamese, again, if you look back through the history, they, for a long time, were of the view that they have to do a low-level guerrilla war because to do more is going to invite a massive war. It's going to be devastating. It's going to be like the Korean War. The United States isn't going to put up with this. And so bombing, for one thing, could have sent that signal early on. In counterfactuals, you can not necessarily be 100% sure, but we can talk in terms of probabilities and understanding what people were thinking at the time and the soundness of their decisions. One thing that I think people often assume, and especially things like the Ken Burns series, they sort of assume the outcome is preordained and that anyone who tried to do something that might change the course of history was simply foolish. I don't think it's correct to say the North Vietnamese would never have given up. If you look at Korea, I think is the closest parallel we have. The North Koreans were also fanatics, zealots, who were really intent on getting the South, and eventually they were convinced that militarily the cost was going to be too high, and they also they had allies telling them it's time to knock it off. We know the Chinese and the Soviets were both very apprehensive about Vietnam, and to some extent at odds with each other. We know, too, the Chinese, actually in 1965, talked to the North Vietnamese and say, if you go to war with the Americans, we're not going to really send troops in to help you guys out. And the Chinese, we as Americans think, well, Korean War was so devastating. We don't want to do that again. Well, the Chinese, it turns out, they thought that way about Korea too. And they, for every American killed, there were 10 Chinese killed. So there certainly could have been a different outcome in that respect. Again, you mentioned the question about American assistance. If you fast forward, another misconception problem people have understanding Vietnam is that how the war evolved. So mentioned earlier, 60, up to 65, it's largely a guerrilla war, relatively low-scale fighting. 65, that changes, even late 64, it becomes much more of a conventional war. In fact, the movie We Were Soldiers is an excellent depiction of how the war is changing. You have massive units on both sides fighting with very conventional means, and that often gets lost. Oftentimes you'll hear people say, well, the guerrillas defeated us. In fact, there's really not much of a guerrilla war in the last part of the war. You have aspects of guerrilla attacks, but by the time you get to 1972, it really is a conventional war. So in 1972, in what's called the Eastern Invasion, something that more people need to know about, 14 North Vietnamese Army divisions come down into South Vietnam. And by this time, the Americans have pulled out our troops. We have advisors. We have air support. But if you listen to the people who were pessimistic about what we had done, you would think South Vietnamese are going to fold. There's no American combat troops here, 14 enemy divisions. Well, South Vietnamese actually prevail. They defeat the attacking force. I mean, our air power helped. And some people will say, well, yeah, they just won because of our air power, but we fought with air power too, and we don't say, well, it was just because of air power. So you certainly needed some ground power there. And I believe had we continued that support, we could have sustained that. The North Vietnamese, I think, after that, if they had seen we were going to stick with it, they would probably not have done something like that again because they would know the outcome would be the same. Unfortunately, after 1973, partly because of Watergate, Congress puts restrictions on the use of firepower. It also reduces the aid, and it's stated very clearly at the time that South Vietnam is going to need aircraft, they're going to need spare parts, they're going to need oil. And this also happens to be when the oil crisis is happening. When we were defending South Vietnam, it's got this massive exposed left flank, so you need a lot of mobility to deal with that. You need helicopters, trucks, tanks, etc. And by the time you get to 74, South Vietnam's starting to run low on these supplies. It can't keep moving around to the same extent. It's running short on other supplies. And our military makes clear we need to provide this certain level of aid to keep South Vietnam afloat. And Congress, partly despite Nixon, because the Democratic Congress didn't like him, decided we're not going to provide that much. And so I think by the time the North Vietnamese actually attack in 75, the writing is kind of on the wall, because South Vietnam, it's no longer can fly its helicopters around. It's got to defend this massive, long country. Enemy can attack at points of its choosing. And so I think that was one of the biggest disgraces in our history, was how we abandoned the South Vietnamese. And if you talk to most veterans, I think they also find this just an extremely distressing, and especially given that we had done so much. We'd actually gotten to the point where they were largely self-sufficient. There weren't going to be lots of American casualties if we continue this. And so South is lost, and again, enormous humanitarian costs. Now, some people, we should add, will say, well, the North Vietnamese, though, eventually figured out that capitalism was actually a better system, and that probably would have happened all along, so why did we even need to fight this whole war? And, I argue, well, first of all, it's the North Vietnamese fault for thinking communism was going to work, and so fighting this massive war over this. But also their variant of capitalism is not what we would like. I mean, North Vietnam is still, or Vietnam today is not South Korea. It's not a close ally of ours. It's not a democracy. It is still closer to China than I think they let on. So I do think it was truly tragic, and that was yet another of what I think are several opportunities that we had to maintain this country, and we blew it.
So before I ask my next question, this is just a heads up. After this question, in all likelihood, will go to the audience. And so any questions you might have, if you're thinking about them now. As my students know, I'm not shy about calling on people.
Is that why everybody's leaving?
So if I don't get a hand up, I'll call on somebody. So my last question has to do with a follow-on book to Triumph Forsaken that you wrote, called Triumph Revisited, which was a critical analysis by multiple people of your work. And in the foreword to that book, I thought was probably one of the more poignant observations. Modest enough on the face of it, Moyar's argument impacted academic orthodoxies on Vietnam with the same force as an earlier set of theses shook the Roman Catholic Church. Moyar indeed has faced Martin Luther's punishments, anathematization and excommunication. Some reviewers and commentators seemed willing at least to consider burning at the stake, professionally, if not literally. Can you talk about the reception from your point of view to Triumph Forsaken and your other books in the academic community and in other audiences?
Yeah, so it has been, there was a lot of, shall we say, pushback in the academic community. I think we, unfortunately, are at a time when there is not the same respect for differing opinions that we used to have. Now, when I was an undergraduate, I had professors like Bernard Balin, Ernest May, Harvey Mansfield, who, and a lot of others from that generation that really were open to new ideas. They weren't obsessed with what somebody's political leanings were or what political inclinations might be. But that generation has moved on, and we've gotten to a place where people do focus on that. And I got my PhD in England. It was interesting to see in England it's still not as political, and they notice when they have American professors come over that when things like hiring decisions come up, the Americans seem to be so concerned about what somebody's political viewpoint is, which, in my view, shouldn't really be part of the equation. But I think it clearly has, and I think it reflects a broader problem in the culture. Because one of our founding principles in this country was pluralism, the recognition that there's a chance we may get things wrong, and so we need to listen to what other people have to say. And so, for me personally, I spent a lot of time looking in academic career, spent some time with the military, but it's unfortunate how badly politicized it's become. So I do think, I'll say, in my case, I was fortunate that I was able to find other useful things to do, and working with the military has been a pleasure. I've also been able to continue academic work, but it is especially difficult for people who maybe don't have that sort of fallback or other opportunities to pursue. I think it's incredibly difficult these days for people who want to pursue an academic career that don't adhere to what is seen to be the preferred viewpoint. And I think it's unfortunate because there's a lot at stake in our academic world, our academic communities. But if anyone is interested in that, I have some tips I can provide to you offline in terms of how to succeed in that manner. But I think it's one of the great things about the program here is you do have the ability to bring in people with different viewpoints. I think that's something that's missing too much on our college campuses. My daughter's a freshman, or can we say freshman still? First year. So I'm very cognizant of that, and it's not necessarily always that people have ill intentions or different people have different views, but I think there's also fear of what someone has to say, which again I think is a really toxic problem that we probably need to spend more time thinking about how we address that.
Okay, first question from the audience.
Thank you. Hi, I'll date myself. I was at Berkeley from 1969 to 73 and saw a lot of anti-war riots, but I was a conservative Christian at that point, and I became a minister. I'm now retired from the ministry, and one of the things from a spiritual perspective is that we say the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And in Vietnam, there was an explosion of faith under the persecution when the communists took over. But really, that was part of the rationale of fighting communism, was that they cheapened human life because they were based on atheism. And the irony that I'd like you to address, that I thought was the greatest irony, was after the U.S. pulled out and Cambodia was liquidating its people under the Khmer Rouge Pol Pot regime, Senator George McGovern, who was the leader of the anti-war movement, came out and publicly said, as he saw this tragedy happening in Cambodia, he called for the intervention by the United Nations by force, if possible, to stop the bloodshed. After that was the expected result of the domino effect of atheistic communism. And what is your evaluation of McGovern's statements after the war?
Well, I don't think the United Nations intervening by force is ever going to be a particularly valid option, but especially not in that case. I would say, one of the noteworthy parts of the division of Vietnam in 1954 is you have almost 1 million people, many of them Catholics, going from the north to the south, and they turn out to be some of the most virulent supporters of the government because they had seen communism firsthand in North Vietnam and understood what it actually meant for people who were not willing to go along with its dictates. And we did see, one of the ironies too, I mentioned there were these Buddhist protests going on, and we overthrew a government because we thought they were being too repressive. Well, the communists were extremely repressive, and they had no tolerance for these Buddhist organizers. They also pretty harsh in dealing with the church. They've eased up a bit, but there's still it's still very much a police state. You still, foreign missionaries are very constrained in what they could do. Certainly, I'd also say, President Diem and other South Vietnamese leaders were themselves close to the Vietnamese Catholic community, Catholic Church, and there was not this huge divide between Catholic and Buddhist that I think we often see, because we know Diem actually supported extensive construction of Buddhist pagodas, among other things. But it was, and that was, again, another thing I didn't mention, the burns, is the whole Khmer Rouge genocide, because at the time, too, that was kind of poo-pooed as, there were a lot of people in 1975 say, well, the U.S. is going to leave, and this is actually better net for the region because, America has been this irritant in the system, and now everyone's going to get along, and as we know, of course, the Khmer Rouge killed, I think it was 1.4 million people, which was just, again, could have been avoided, I think, had we been more forceful in how we act.
Next question.
What was the impact of the Vietnam War on the American public's faith in the government, and how is that reflected today?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So, as I mentioned, one of the things I mentioned that's very relevant to this is President Lyndon Johnson did mislead the American people on things like sending American troops, what we were doing with troops. That did have, I think, unfortunate and enduring impact, and I do fault him for that. I think Kennedy made some mistakes. Nixon had his share of mistakes, although I think if you look back, we probably didn't scrutinize previous presidents as much. I mean, if you look back at the history of Franklin Roosevelt, as I've done more recently, he's not quite the saint that we sometimes think him to be either. I think, the fact that presidents lie and mislead is probably less important ultimately than this broader question of was this war fundamentally misguided or not. And in my view, the country very much became polarized around this issue, and I think still is. And if you, in the discussions over the Burns aftermath, Burns kind of went around to various places and tried to, be the reconciler between veterans and those who, didn't go or dodged the draft. And I think by and large, that was a flop. I mean, I didn't see a whole lot of reconciliation going on there. But it affected sort of elite society. I think the seminal event in 1968, the Chicago Democratic Convention, you have the establishment Democrats with Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey. On the one side, you have sort of the new left who are going against the war. You have these big clashes and led to then George McGovern's candidacy, stridently anti-war. And this notion that Vietnam War is this terrible stain on America, I think has endured, certainly in that generation, and it's informed a lot of how people think of our role in the world. Are we a force for good or not? We had a lot of successive presidents addressed it. Ronald Reagan talked about Vietnam being a noble cause, and he certainly sided with the veteran community on that. George H.W. Bush said we had kind of kicked the Vietnam thing in Iraq, although I think that was a bit misplaced confidence. Clinton was concerned about another Vietnam, and it keeps coming up. Now, I think an interesting question will be to what extent it remains an agenda item as sort of the Vietnam generation gets older and younger generations come up. I mean, someone from sort of a post-Vietnam generation, I think we don't pay as much attention to it, but I do think to some extent Iraq has taken that over. Although Iraq's a little interesting because you have, it's less clear-cut ideologically in terms of who did what. But I think Vietnam, part of I think why Vietnam was so visceral was you did have the draft, and so Iraq and Afghanistan, people could kind of opt out of it and not get too concerned. I certainly see in the academic world that the Vietnam generation has instilled similar worldview in the following generation. There's similar hostility to different views of the Vietnam War, similar hostility to other viewpoints in general.
Next question.
Hi, Dr. Moore. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. My question for you is, how pivotal was the Vietnam War in shaping global trade relations after 1975 to today between the East and the West, especially in Southeast Asia?
So Lee Kuan Yew, who was the Prime Minister of Singapore, has repeatedly made the case, and I think persuasively, that I mentioned this period 65 to 75 where we were buying time. In his view, that period allowed the development of ASEAN, it allowed other countries in the region to develop and to turn into major trading partners. So I think had we basically pulled out in 65, I think Southeast Asia and a good chance also Japan would have gone into China's orbit. We would have, I think it would have had highly detrimental impact on our trade. Exactly what that would have looked like, I don't think anyone knows. But that concern about maintaining trade with Asia was there from the beginning. Eisenhower talked a lot about it as well. And it's a big issue now as we think we compete with China. China's certainly interested in changing the nature of trade relationships there. And so, again, this is a war that continues to reverberate on the international stage today.
Hi. I was wondering if you could shed any light on incidents such as the My Lai massacre and the type of morality and consciousness that would have caused incidents like this where over 350 to 500 South Vietnamese civilians were slaughtered by American troops, and what type of reverberation would that have on the American public? Because these events were recorded. So I think that might be a stem of some of the negative accusations against the war effort. So I was wondering if you had any insights on subjects like that.
Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, I'm working on the sequel to Triumph Forsaken now after going in different directions when I have spare time from my current work. But so I actually was just working on the My Lai section. One of the things about My Lai that one of the biggest controversies is, was this an isolated incident or was it indicative of some broader trend? I'd say even a lot of people not favorably inclined to the war would agree that this was in fact an isolated event, at least in terms of its scope. But there have been some recent efforts to try to dispute that. I think after My Lai happened, there were actually investigations into lots of other incidents, and there was in fact nothing approaching that scale. Now there were quite a few instances of individual murders, but if you go back and look in the history of warfare, including our own World War II, there were plenty of cases of Americans killing civilians oftentimes punished, but not always. One of the fascinating questions too about My Lai is why did it actually happen in this one place, in this one time? I think fundamentally it's a question of the small number of leaders who were on the ground involved in this. Certainly Lieutenant Calley and maybe a couple of others. One of the things people argue is, well, that this unit had faced booby traps and mines, had lost people. They were angry at the Vietnamese, but that happened to a lot of other units, and in fact, we showed impressive restraint in most cases. So this was the only case where actual leadership basically authorized people and encouraged people to go in and kill others. Now, it did get covered up essentially for about a year before it eventually came out. The reaction to it was interesting. By the time it comes out in 1969, I think the country's already pretty split and people have largely made up their minds on the war, so I don't think it had a great deal of impact. And you see, so for people who are opposed to the war, this was kind of exhibit number one on how bad it was. And at the time, people didn't necessarily know that that we knew there weren't lots of other incidents like this going on. Again, at this point, we would have, I think, certainly known had it come out. But for people who supported the war, this, to some people, they said, well, this was just part of the harsh realities of war. And if again, looking in the Pacific War, for example, the U.S., committed some things of this nature against the Japanese, and nobody seemed to care about it. So, I think we're certainly more sensitive now in this day and age to these sorts of incidents and more careful. I do think we've gotten better in terms of sort of psychological evaluation of people, because clearly, the fundamental mistake was putting individuals like this in command of units and not having proper supervision for them.
Somewhere I saw that part of the content you used the reference to troops forsaken. That caused me to infer that you were suggesting that there were certain acts of omission or commission committed by one or more. Background, Navy, aircraft carrier, Tonkin Gulf, lucky Vietnam veteran, if you want to call me one. I had the 3 hots and a cot, not in harm's way. My friend served on the mainland and in actual combat. I debriefed pilots and gave them weather briefings as they were bombing North Vietnam. The resentment of those men, because I was just enlisted, of the educated men, was resentment towards the McNamara War, and with regard to the identification or prevention of targets, the men that I briefed and debriefed on weather, and we're only allowed to go certain places for the most part. There were certain exceptions to that. And, I'm not a great analytical thinker, militarily, E5 as far as I got, and I know that the world is not gray. It's not black and white. There's a lot of gray in the world. Mm-hmm. But my simplistic reasoning is that when you send men or women somewhere where they're going to die, and I'm talking about on both sides, you go there with a clear objective. You go there maybe to at least to win or to have a clear objective. And I don't know that was the case. I've done a lot of readings. I've read several books over the years because of my interest. But who forsake or forsook the men like John and other people here, from your perspective, in all candor?
Yeah. So, one of the things that H.R. McMaster in his book did especially effectively was to draw out some of the differences between Secretary of Defense McNamara and the military. And as you may know, McNamara wrote a book later where, to some extent, he kind of made it seem like he was atoning. But if you look closely, a lot of that book was basically attempted to fend off this criticism that he hadn't listened to the military. Now, I think, and as I write in this, and it's also going to be in my next book because it continues after 65, McNamara and a number of others had, I think, an excessive confidence in their own intelligence and abilities. McNamara had gone to the most prestigious universities. He had been this great success at the Ford Motor Company. And I think, and he also brought in these people who were statisticians, and they thought that their way of thinking was superior to sort of the Neanderthal thinking of the military. And I think he was mistaken in many cases. I mean, not all, but the bombing is one case I mentioned where they have this idea that we're going to apply an academic theory that says if we do a little bomb here, our adversary is going to presume that supposedly they understand this academic theory, and they're going to also they're going to back off. And at this time, the military was saying, no, we got to hit them really hard and as hard as we can. And that theme comes up again and again. And I think, with the benefit of hindsight, I think the military was right in that case to say, do everything you can when it's possible. There's also debates go on and on about which targets you bomb in North Vietnam, and military generally wanted to take more risk, go after more targets. So I do fault McNamara for some of the big mistakes. I mean, also the Ho Chi Minh Trail, should talk a bit more about that. That was also something the military wanted to do. Many of them, they said, that men and material keep coming through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we can kill them all we want in South Vietnam, but if this trail's open, they're just going to keep coming. And the McNamara and some of the other civilians said, well, you don't understand this guerrilla warfare theory that, and according to this, it's an internal conflict, and they're just causing problems in South Vietnam, and that's where we have to focus. Again, they didn't fully comprehend the extent to which this had become a conventional external conflict. As I mentioned, in terms of who squandered our victories, our successes, again, 63 coup is a huge mistake. Again, Henry Cabot Lodge was the biggest culprit in that, our ambassador, but there were also others like Averill Harriman, James Forrestal. There were at the same time a lot of Americans pushing back on that, including Victor Krulak, later famous Marine, our general at the time, Paul Harkins. In terms of the 75 decision, that was, or the decision to pull the plug at the end of the war, and that was largely Congress. There's a lot of anti-war sentiment, again, also anti-Nixon sentiment, and a lot of this was intended, there was this visceral hatred of Nixon, and since Nixon liked Vietnam, we're gonna stick it to him there and cause him difficulty.
At one point, you were speaking and you said that it would be good to have every person serve in the military, and then you changed it to say it would be good to have every male serve in the military. Why did you make this change?
Well, I would say I tend to be of the view that men and women have differences, which I know is not always in fashion in this part of the world. I mean, if you look in historically, that has been an area where, in Vietnam, World War II, the military was almost entirely male. It's still predominantly male. A lot of women don't want to serve or don't like what the military is about. As I said, there's civilian options. There has been some talk about trying to create, gender parity. I just don't think that's realistic or something we would want to pursue. I think, if you look statistically, the genders have different views as to what career options they would like to pursue. So, and we've never actually had, there actually were some efforts to try to push a draft of both men and women in response to this effort to integrate women into the combat forces. I don't think anything came of that. I think it was more a political ploy. The other, part of it is too, there's still, large sections of the military that require physical tests that males pass in much larger numbers. I think the Marine Corps Infantry Officer course, for several years, there was not a single woman who completed that course. I think one has finally done it, but if you have, such small numbers of people getting through, I think it's just unrealistic to expect that you would have parity. But again, if we decided something that everyone should do, you could certainly look at this civilian service option.
I have three questions. First, have you ever been to Vietnam?
I have been, yes.
And you've met the people there?
Yes.
Recently?
No, not recently, no.
Okay. I was in Vietnam a year and a half ago, again. And I understand those people, I think. I was in the Vietnam era, and I served. I did not have to go to Vietnam, but I trained a lot of people that did go there. But I was in college, and I got drafted after 5.5 semesters of engineering. This happened to a lot of people. And we were put in the situation where we were lied to a lot by our military, by our leaders, by our officers. A lot of the officers were not as educated as we were. And it was difficult to deal with these people. And after we came back, we were treated like crap. Baby killers. And then we discovered that the lies were coming from the top in our government. Lyndon Johnson did some, but Tricky Dicky did a lot more. Bombing Laos without anybody's knowledge. Lots of things going on. And so my question is, how do you rationale what you're talking about when this all came out with the Pentagon Papers?
Yeah, well, as I said, there were lots of lies. Again, if you look at Woodrow Wilson in World War I or Franklin Roosevelt in World War II, there was, I don't know if anyone's done analysis, but there were plenty of lies in those cases too. So I think it's part of a broader problem. But certainly I think it was, that does pose problems for us as we think about it. Again, I think we don't fault Wilson and Roosevelt because things kind of turned out okay. In terms of having officers that you had problems with, I'd say having, one of the other things I spent a lot of time doing is looking at military leadership, and I think, and even also if you read a lot of military literature, one of the most enduring themes is that in every armed service there are some toxic leaders. There's some great leaders, and there's some in between, and I think if you get under a toxic leader, no matter what the time or place, your experience is, it's a good chance your experience is going to be less than pleasant. One of the things I've been pushing for is more rigor in our armed forces, and we've gotten better. A few years ago, the Army came up with a whole effort around toxic leadership and how to identify it, how to try to combat it. I think we've gotten somewhat better, but I've also been in other parts of the government. It's a reality in government and the military. It's oftentimes harder to get rid of those people than it is, say, in the private sector. And as far as coming back and a negative reception, I think that was certainly a big problem, and one of the biggest problems I think our veterans face. A lot of why I got interested in Vietnam originally was I met a few Vietnam veterans who were high school teachers of mine, but were very sort of honorable, decent people, and they didn't fit the veteran stereotype that you saw on TV or read about. And so, over time, it became increasingly clear that our history, our academia, our journalists had done a disservice by how they had portrayed veterans as being maladjusted. And I think trying to pin the blame, and one of the biggest things, and even a lot of the anti-war movement will now admit this, is that they made a mistake in trying to pin the blame for Vietnam on the veterans, because it clearly was not, the people making the decisions were not the same people who were out there fighting. And we in a democracy, I think, expect that when we call in a time of emergency, we agree that when the government says we need to fight a war, then citizens, even if they didn't necessarily like the president or the decision, are going to join. And so I think we've gotten better in understanding that, and that we didn't see the same treatment of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. So that's one of the positive things I think we've seen more recently.
Well, the thing is, you lost a generation, at least a good part of it, because of the lies that we were told and the things that happened, and you couldn't even trust the people at the top, like Nixon, trying to cover things up. And so a lot of people just gave up. They don't trust the government.
Yeah, so a lot of people don't trust it. I mean, although, as I said, I think Iraq equally, if not more nowadays, is, and that's on both sides of the aisle, I would say there's been, and I'm not sure there was ever a good old time where we had complete confidence in our government, but I think certainly that's been, I think Vietnam did something, certainly Watergate contributed to that, although again, you could argue that, some of the things that Nixon done had been done by people before, they just didn't get caught. And right now we're in a time where there's a lot of distrust of government, and I think it's unfortunate. One of the broader issues we have as a country is the sort of polarization, and that's also been something we've had for a long time, but it's probably been exacerbated by technology, where you can talk just to people who share your view, which is also, I think, a problem we've had in our universities. It's not healthy to be in an environment where one side is doing all or most of the talking.
Next question.
Yeah, I am a Vietnam veteran, and you had said that the majority of the Vietnam War was middle and upper income. Could you explain that to me?
Not the majority. I said that they were people from middle and upper middle class communities did serve in substantial numbers. They weren't not the majority, but if you look compared, it was actually in terms of education and income, it was more. There were more educated people in Vietnam than, say, the Army of World War II.
Well, see, I came from a town about 30 miles from here, and I was drafted in 1966. And the majority of the kids that weren't drafted were going to college, and all the rest of us were drafted. Now, John McCain, Senator McCain, had just said this months ago, that it was how do you say that? It was a poor man's war.
I don't think that's quite accurate. I said certainly it's absolutely true that some elements of the more affluent did find lots of ways to get out of going. And so, and I think, and there's a lot of feelings of guilt now over that. But again, also that gets back to the question of, I think, why some people, if you found a way out, and a lot of people found deferments that didn't seem necessarily all that straightforward or honest. I think that's part of why there's inclination, some people to depict this as a bad war, or the veterans as maladjusted, because that, to some extent, justifies efforts to avoid going. But thank you for serving too, and yeah, appreciate it. I do think that's also part of why it would be useful to have a draft, is because increasingly some parts of our society, especially the better educated, are staying out of the military, and we're increasingly isolated from one another.
And he had said about, this fellow back here had said about incompetence. I've seen it, but I had spent 10 months in the jungle out of 12, but I never seen it in the jungle. That was, and I believe these guys know what I'm talking about. You don't go pushing people around in the jungle, because that's not going to work. They never come back. Thank you.
Yeah, and one of the things that was pretty commonplace too was a lot of the least competent people would be left in the rear because they couldn't cause as much mayhem or trouble. So you put the more competent people in the truly life and death situations. I mean, there were certainly mistakes, but having spent a lot of time looking at many different battles, I think in general we did very well. I mean, again, in any army, any war, there will be mistakes. One other thing that I would add that was a big issue in the war, Johnson was, this was another thing where military and McNamara didn't see eye to eye. The military kept saying you have to call up the reserves, because the reserves had a lot of your most experienced leadership, technical skills. Yeah, and Johnson and McNamara throughout said, well, this is going to be politically unpopular, we're not going to do it, and so you ended up having a lot more junior officers and NCOs having to serve. So that was another thing where I think the military had it right.
That was an unbelievable murder. It's really hard to explain. Really hard.
Next question.
You never mentioned Agent Orange. I know why we used it. Did our government not know the long-term ramifications of using such a
Well, at
agent?
the time, I think their general view was that Agent Orange was, Agent Orange was a herbicide that was used to clear jungle and other forests that were used by the North Vietnamese enemy forces to conceal themselves. And at the time, it was seen as basically just like something you'd have in your, spray in your yard. People, I know from people who worked in Agent Orange, they would spill the stuff all over themselves and not think anything of it. And now it later, there later emerged some evidence linking it to various health issues. Now, that's also been some enduring controversy as to how much of that is, how much of a link there is, but I think certainly our government has taken the position there is a link, and in fact, the U.S. government right now supports programs in Vietnam to address those issues, but it is, I think you could probably say it's another instance of the cost that veterans had to pay. I know certainly we're seeing that again with Iraq, and there are some other cases of these mysterious illnesses coming up. But yet at the time, I don't think anybody had any idea that this was going to be linked to health issues.
There's some pretty strong anecdotal evidence that was the case. The gentleman who was head of the Navy at the time, Admiral Zumwalt, his son served in Vietnam in an area where Agent Orange was used heavily, and very few years after the war died of cancer that was thought to have been caused by the Agent Orange.
Yeah.
Mark, this has been terrific. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you, sir. Thanks. Pleasure.